Some names once rang out in the smoke of rifles and the cheers of victory, only to be forgotten in the endless grasslands. And then there are names that never get spoken at all. Because when the war finally ended, what was left behind wasn't glory, it was scars. Jonas Hale was one of those names. Folks said he survived because of his coldness, but it was that very coldness that turned him into the man the people of Dry Creek Crossing eyed with suspicion. He had lost everything: his wife, his family, even the right to sleep through a night without waking in a sweat. The only thing he still carried was his resentment. But before we go deeper, make sure to like this video and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Out here in these Western stories, you, the audience, help keep the fire alive, so the journeys of survivors like Jonas won't vanish into silence. And I promise you this: the story ahead will grip you: a life shattered by war, a town that never forgives, and a choice that will change everything. Jonas Hale, just past 40, had once been a Union scout during the war. Folks used to praise his eyes, sharp as blades, able to spot horse tracks from miles away. They used to marvel at his ears, quick enough to tell the difference between Confederate cavalry hooves and the pounding of Apache ponies in the dark. But now, those talents felt more like a curse. Each time he walked down the main stretch of Dry Creek Crossing, he could feel the stairs sticking into his back like knives. No one spoke it aloud, but he knew they hated him because he reminded them of what they all wanted to forget. His wife, Miriam, had died 10 years earlier of fever. A small grave on the slope behind his ranch was the only proof he'd once had a family. Since then, he'd lived in silence, with nothing but the wind rattling through broken tin and the moan of warped boards in the winter storms. That ranch should have collapsed years ago, but Jonas fought to keep it upright, not because he loved the land, but because he refused to let fate strip away the last thing he could still hold. When he entered Dry Creek Crossing one dusty afternoon, Jonas brought no smile, no greetings. He guided a pair of worn-down mules, just as starved as his own frame, to buy only what he needed: salt, coffee, nails, and a new whetstone. Nothing more. No wasted words, no idle glances. He knew the longer he lingered, the greater the chance some drunk would drag his past back into the open. And Jonas had sworn he would never give those tavern rats the chance to tear open wounds he'd buried deep. Some said Jonas was crazy. Others called him a ghost, walking out of hell to haunt the living. But the truth was simpler. He was a man who carried a grudge against fate itself. Resentment had become his very breath. Every morning, the sunrise wasn't a blessing. It was a challenge. Every time a blizzard snapped another fence post, Jonas drove it back into the earth with the fury of a man punching destiny in the jaw. That was how he lived: not to enjoy life, but to fight against it, against being forgotten, against the loneliness, against the pity strangers felt for those lucky survivors of war. Deep down, Jonas Hale had never forgiven anyone, not his enemies, not the friends who abandoned him, and not even himself. Dry Creek Crossing could pretend not to notice him. Folks could look away, hurry their steps when his gaunt shadow appeared at the end of the street. But Jonas still walked, head bowed, eyes narrowed, lips silent, fists tight on the reins. He knew one slip, one crack in the wall he'd built, and the mocking laughter, the war stories, the blame would all come back again, and he was too tired to hear it once more. What no one expected was that this meaningless supply run would soon bring Jonas face to face with a choice he had never imagined. A choice that could shatter the wall of resentment that had kept him alive all these years, or push him into a new abyss. And from that moment, our story begins. They say Dry Creek Crossing never offers much more than red dust and cheap whiskey. But that afternoon, when Jonas Hale meant only to head straight for the general store, he caught the sound rolling out of the old livery yard. Shouts, boots stomping dirt, the rasp of cruel laughter. And then one word cut through it all, sharp enough to stop him in his tracks. Auction. The crowd packed in tight, like vultures circling a carcass. Some laughed, some spat, others just stared with that empty look men get when cruelty passes for entertainment. Jonas didn't mean to be part of it, but his steps slowed, as if pulled by a hand he couldn't see. He had lived long enough among blood and injustice, yet there was something in that word today that would not let him walk past. And then he saw her, a young Apache woman, thin but unbroken. She was chained to a rough post, iron biting into her wrists until they bled. Her deerskin dress hung torn, beadwork and feathers dangling like relics of a life stolen away. Her black hair was tangled, half braided, half loose, whipped by the wind. But it was her eyes that held everyone. They didn't beg, they didn't plead, they didn't soften. They stared straight through the men jeering at her as if they weren't even there. Cold, steady, defiant. The eyes of someone who refused to kneel, refused to cry, refused to surrender dignity for the comfort of her captors. Jonas felt his chest knot. It wasn't beauty that struck him. It was recognition. He had seen those eyes in the mirror after the war eyes of a survivor. Not because life had been kind, but because death had been denied. A man nearby muttered loud enough for all 3 days. Others sold fast. Not this one. Won't bow. Won't cry. Just stands there. Folks say she's cursed or just plain stubborn. The crowd roared laughter, harsh and empty. Jonas ground his teeth. He wanted nothing of this. Part of him ached to turn away. Buy his salt and coffee. Retreat back to the cold ranch and the grave on the hill. Let the world rot on its own. But then her head lifted. Her eyes cut to him. A fleeting moment. Quick. Precise, no hope. No plea. Just a measure. Threat or chance, Jonas knew that look. He had lived by it himself. He drew a breath. If he left now, by sundown some drunk with coins and poison in his head would drag her off. Everyone knew the end to that story. And the thought of it lit a fire inside him he thought had died years ago. Not pity anger. Anger at a world that allowed this. Anger at himself if he walked away. His hand slid inside his coat. Folded bills. Coins he had counted twice that morning. He stepped through the circle of men until he stood in front of the trader. His voice cracked from disuse. How much? The man blinked. Surprised anyone asked. Then smirked and named a price more than he expected. Less than her life was worth. Jonas didn't haggle. He pressed the money into the man's palm. Bills slapped skin. Chains dropped. The clatter rang louder than the laughter. She didn't move at first. Didn't rub her wrists. Didn't look at anyone. Only when Jonas turned did she step forward. Bare feet struck dirt, leaving faint traces of blood. But her back stayed straight. Jonas didn't touch her, didn't guide her. He climbed onto the wagon seat. After a moment, she climbed up too, silent, her hands folded in her lap. The wagon rolled. Dust lifted behind them. Laughter trailed off. No one followed. Jonas kept his eyes on the road. He hadn't bought her to own her. He hadn't freed her to claim her. He had done it because leaving her there would have been leaving himself behind all over again. And she knew every choice left to her was a bad one. But some were worse. At least here, walking into the unknown beside a stranger. She wasn't staring down a mob alone. The wagon wheels creaked. The mules trotted in their steady rhythm, side by side. They rode in silence, two strangers, still wary, still guarded. But from that moment forward, neither was forced to face the world entirely alone. The wagon rattled its way back to Jonas's ranch as the last light bled out of the sky. The land stretched dry and cracked, scarred like the man who called it home. Beside him, Nayeli sat stiff on the plank seat, clutching his old coat tight around her legs. Her eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, unreadable. Her silence taut as a bowstring drawn but not loosed. Jonas said nothing. Every time he glanced her way, he caught sight of the raw red marks circling her wrists, skin torn and crusted with blood. Words pressed at the back of his throat, but he swallowed them down and held the reins tighter. The creak of wheels and the steady rhythm of the mules became the only music on that long stretch of road, awkward, unfamiliar, but shared. When the wagon stopped in front of his sagging cabin, Jonas climbed down first. He didn't offer his hand. He only stepped aside, leaving her free to follow or not. Bare feet touched the hard ground. A flicker of pain crossed her face, then vanished. Jonas noticed. He didn't speak. Respect, he decided, meant letting her keep her strength. The cabin door groaned open. Inside was a single room, a wood stove, a crooked-legged table, a few rough chairs, and 2 beds, one wide, one narrow against the far wall. Jonas shifted his weight, voice low and hoarse. That one. Yours. If you want it. Nayeli didn't answer. Her gaze swept the room, lingering briefly on a small ring left on the table. She gave nothing away, only moved toward the smaller bed and lowered herself to its edge. Her hand touched the worn blanket, fingers testing its frayed fabric. Jonas held still, uneasy, as if the space between them had suddenly stretched wider than the walls themselves. He turned away, crouched by the stove, and laid in kindling. Soon the smell of beans and squash filled the air. He ladled stew into 2 tin bowls. One he set on the table, the other nearer her bed. No words, no gesture, just choice. She took her place close to the fire, cross-legged, coat still across her lap. She ate slowly, spoon scraping softly against the tin, eyes never leaving the flames. Jonas sat at the table, shoulders bowed, chewing his share. The silence pressed heavy, but not hostile. It was the silence of 2 people who had lost too much to bother filling air with useless words. When the bowls were empty, Jonas rinsed them, set them to dry by the window. He pulled a heavier blanket from the shelf and laid it at the foot of her bed. Then, without comment, he dragged out a rough plank and measured space in his head, planning a divider. Some small barrier of wood so she could have privacy if she chose it. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Respect lived in the work of his hands. Nayeli watched, eyes softened by the firelight. She knew she wasn't a guest, not a possession either. But his silence was different from the silence of other men. Not a threat, not a command waiting to be spoken. Just space. Night fell deep. Jonas banked the fire, blew out the lamp. The cabin sank into glow and shadow. He lay on the larger bed, eyes fixed on the beams above. Across the room, Nayeli lay on her side, eyes open, breaths thin and shallow. Neither slept. Both listened to the wind clawing at the walls, to the pop of burning wood, to each other's quiet presence. Jonas thought of the grave on the hill, and how, come Sunday, he would have to stand there and tell Miriam the truth he had brought another into their home. The thought burned with guilt, but also, strangely, with relief. For the first time in years, the cabin wasn't empty. Nayeli closed her eyes, steadying her heart. Chains and dark hands still haunted her in memory. But here there was no barked order, no blade, no jeering crowd, only silence. And she realized not every silence was punishment. Some silences carried respect. They lay awake until nearly dawn, strangers sharing 4 wooden walls. They didn't know what tomorrow would demand. But that first night, between awkwardness and respect, they endured together not as master and captive, not as owner and owned, but as 2 souls learning how to breathe in each other's company without fear. Morning on Jonas's ranch always began the same cold wind slicing through the cracks in the walls, and the lonely cluck of hens out in the yard. But that morning held something new. When Jonas stepped onto the porch with a bucket in hand, he saw a second set of footprints pressed into the dirt, smaller, lighter. Not his, not the mule's, hers. Nayeli had risen early, trailing him quietly, the old coat wrapped tight around her shoulders. Jonas didn't question it. He just gave a short nod and went on scattering feed. But when he bent to lift the broken coop door, she was already there. She studied the hinge, found a scrap of wire on the ground, looped it through, twisted it tight. The door held firm. Jonas paused, watching. No words passed, but in his silence was a quiet acknowledgement. The rest of the day, they worked side by side. The north fence had been leaning since the last storm. Jonas drove posts into the hard ground, muscles straining with each swing. Nayeli picked up the hammer without waiting to be told, shoulders steady, striking nails clean and sharp. When the handle split, Jonas handed her his own. She didn't meet his eyes, just kept working. At midday, they rested under the thin shadow of a cedar. Jonas tore a piece of dried meat, passed it across. She took it, ate slow. He held out the canteen. She drank, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, and passed it back. He finished the rest. No thanks, no ceremony. But in the silence, something fragile had taken root, trust. By afternoon, Jonas chopped wood behind the barn. The thud of his axe echoed steady in the dry air. When he glanced up, Nayeli was crouched at the coop again, fastening the hinge with a bent nail she had found. Patient, deliberate, her hand steady. Jonas stood a moment, watching her fix what he'd left broken, and felt the corner of his mouth twitch as if it might smile. When dusk bled into the hills, they went inside. Jonas stirred the stew pot while Nayeli swept the floor clean, stirring up dust that had lingered for years. Then he dragged out a wide plank, measuring it against the wall. The night before, he'd only thought of it. Tonight, he built it a divider, something to mark her space as her own. The hammer rang through the room. Nayeli sat near the stove, arms around her knees, eyes following his every strike. When the plank wall finally stood between the small bed and the rest of the cabin, her gaze softened. He hadn't said a word. He didn't need to. The meaning was clear. She was free to belong without being claimed. That evening, they ate closer than before. Jonas no longer sat with his back turned. Instead, he took the chair by the fire, where Nayeli also chose to sit. The space between them wasn't gone, but it no longer felt like a wall, just room enough for both to breathe. After supper, Jonas washed the bowls. Nayeli rose, took a rag, and wiped the table without being asked. He blinked, surprised, then let her be. Small things, simple things, but for a house that had known only silence. It was a kind of music. Night pressed down. Jonas stretched out on the larger bed, listening to the wind scratch the walls, beyond the new divider. Nayeli lay still under the blanket. He thought of the day her footsteps beside his, the hammer in her hands, the wire twisted firm. For the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel like just shelter against the weather. It felt alive. Nayeli opened her eyes in the dark, staring at the fresh wood. She understood he hadn't drawn rules, hadn't pressed demands. He had simply built space for her to choose. And in that gesture, quiet as it was, a seed of trust had been planted. They were still strangers, still cautious, but through the work of their hands and the silence they no longer feared. They had begun to open to each other. In a place scarred by loss, the leaning fences and the patched coop bore witness to something new, a fragile trust, but real all the same. The days that followed moved in a slow rhythm, but something had shifted. Jonas still rose early, same as always, feeding the mule, splitting wood, walking the fence line. But now, a second set of footsteps trailed his. At first, Nayeli only watched. Then she joined in. By the week's end, they had settled into a pattern, working side by side, hands brushing the same post, passing the same canteen, silent, but not strangers. One afternoon, as the sun sagged low, they sat on a log by the field. Wind carried the smell of dry grass, rattling the fresh wire. Jonas pulled off his gloves, wiping sweat from his brow. Nayeli's voice came sudden, rough but steady. "You had a wife," the question stopped him. After a long moment, he nodded. Her name was Miriam. Got sick, one spring. 6 days later, she was gone. His voice was clipped, heavy with a weight he had carried too long. Nayeli didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. Hair whipped across her cheek. Then she murmured, "I had a family too. They said I shamed my father because I refused a marriage they chose. When the raid came, no one searched for me. To them, I was already dead." Jonas turned, studying her face. No tears, no tremble. Just the cold calm of someone who had lived with pain too long to flinch at it anymore. He understood. He remembered what it was to return from war and find only suspicion in the eyes of the people who should have welcomed him. They sat in silence as the sky burned bronze. And in that silence, there was no suffocation, 'twad only a thread, invisible, stitching their wounds a little closer. That night by the fire, Nayeli spoke again. "They made me be quiet, only spoke to me in commands. So I stopped talking. Easier that way." Jonas leaned forward, scarred hands resting on his knees. His voice was low, steady. "Here. Silence isn't punishment. Here. Silence means peace." She lifted her gaze. For a moment, the hard edge in her eyes gave way. The look was softer. Burden eased. From then on, their silences changed. They no longer felt like walls. They became safe spaces, where neither owed words, and neither judged the lack of them. Another evening, while Jonas patched a bridle, Nayeli sat near the divider, her fingers brushing the fresh wood. Her voice came quiet. "Why did you do this? Bring me here. Build me a place of my own." Jonas met her eyes, plain and unwavering, because no one else should have, and because I had room. She said nothing, but her lips pressed tight, trembling slightly. Not weakness, recognition. For the first time, a man hadn't treated her as property, but as a person. Day by day, trust took root in the small things. When Jonas went to the pasture, she gathered eggs. When Nayeli swept the floor, he stacked wood by the stove. Neither said thank you. They didn't need to. One morning, Jonas returned from the fence line to find the old table fixed its wobbly leg braced with a block of wood. Nayeli sat nearby, sawdust on her palms. Jonas stood still a moment, then allowed himself a rare word. "Good work." Her head lifted, surprise flickering across her face, and in her eyes, for the first time, was something more than defense, a glint of trust. That night, firelight danced across the cabin walls. They didn't trade more stories of loss. They didn't need to. Just sitting near each other, listening to the crackle of burning wood, was enough. Silence, at last, meant rest. Winter came early that year. Snowstorms rolled in heavy, blanketing the fields and cutting the ranch off from the rest of the world. The road to town turned to ice, impassable. For Jonas and Nayeli, life shrank to 4 timber walls, the fire in the stove, and the wind clawing at the shutters. At first, work kept them busy. Jonas hauled wood, fed the mule, checked the fences buried under drifts. Nayeli swept the floor, mended blankets, simmered thin broth of beans and potatoes. They worked in silence, but that silence no longer carried sharp edges. It became rhythm, a kind of breathing between them. Then small moments began to surface. One evening, when Jonas passed her the hammer, their hands brushed. She startled, but didn't pull away at once. He didn't either. The touch was brief, but it lingered, heavier than the howl of the storm outside. Other nights, sitting by the fire, their eyes would meet and hold, not by accident, not as long as lovers, not yet but longer than strangers. In the shifting glow, her eyes, once hard with watchfulness, began to soften, revealing something more human, more near. One night, the wind rattled the cabin so hard the door shuddered in its frame. The fire struggled, pushing only a weak warmth. Nayeli pulled the blanket tight, but her shoulders still shook. Jonas hesitated, then fetched the thickest quilt he owned and stepped toward her. She watched him closely. He didn't speak, only laid it at the edge of her bed. After a pause, she drew it over herself and gave a small nod. Not thanks, not surrender, just acknowledgement. And it was enough. As the nights stacked up, the distance inside the cabin shrank. She no longer turned her back to the divider. Instead, she lay facing him, sometimes letting her gaze linger a moment before closing her eyes. And Jonas, waking in the dark hours, realized he had grown used to her breathing in the room, the presence that kept the emptiness at bay. Then came the night the fire burned low, shadows long and quiet. Nayeli rose from the narrow bed and stepped toward his. Slowly, deliberately. She set her hand on his chest, over the slow beat of his heart. Jonas opened his eyes, met hers in the dark. "Are you sure?" she whispered, her voice steady but trembling with something that wasn't fear. Jonas laid his rough hand over hers, firm but gentle. "If you want," he said quietly. She nodded once. Then, without words, she slipped beneath the blanket beside him. They didn't rush, didn't clutch. They only lay shoulder to shoulder, breath mingling, the warmth of skin a shield against the cold. And in that closeness was more than survival. For the first time, neither of them felt alone. The days that followed carried that new weight. Silence inside the cabin no longer felt empty. It was full of the scrape of spoons against bowls, of hands brushing as tools passed, of eyes steadying on each other across the fire. Outside, winter sealed every road, but inside, Jonas and Nayeli had found a path of their own, a path made not of chains or command, but of trust, of closeness, of sharing the simple truth they were no longer just enduring together. They were beginning to live for one another. Winter loosened its grip slowly, leaving shards of ice glittering in the pastures like broken glass. From the eaves, meltwater dripped steady, a heartbeat against the wood. Jonas stood in the yard, drawing in the damp smell of thawing earth, the scent of life returning. He was used to winters that hollowed a man out, but this year was different. When he stepped back inside the cabin, he wasn't walking into emptiness. Nayeli sat by the window, hair braided down her back, wearing one of his old shirts that hung loose across her shoulders. In her lap lay a strip of deer skin she was mending, the needle moving patient through the torn edge. She looked up as he entered, her lips curved in the faintest smile, brief but bright, enough to warm the room more than the pale sun sliding through the shutters. With the thaw, their work moved in tandem, natural as breathing. Jonas patched the roof beams. Nayeli steadied the ladder, handed up planks. At the well, he carried the heavy bucket. When he sagged with fatigue, her hand pressed lightly to his shoulder, saying without words, "I'm here." One evening, as the fire cracked steady, Nayeli opened the drawer of the old table and pulled out a small box. Inside lay the ring that had once belonged to Miriam. Jonas froze. For years, he had kept it, but never worn it too heavy with memory, too tangled with grief. Nayeli set it gently on the table. sliding it toward him. "This ring. It doesn't belong to me," she said carefully. "But if it still holds meaning, it should be given again." Jonas stared at her across the firelight. There was no demand in her eyes, no claim, only honesty. Slowly, he picked up the ring and stood. He didn't kneel. He didn't speak vows. He simply opened his palm, the ring resting in the center. "If you choose to stay," he said, voice low, "then from this moment, it's yours." Nayeli held his gaze. Then she placed her hand into his, letting her finger slide through the band. Her eyes glimmered not with tears, but with certainty. Not surrender. Recognition. From that night forward, they were no longer just two who had survived. They began to call each other husband and wife, not by law, not by paper, but by choice. A week later, as Jonas pulled on his coat for the pasture, he noticed her standing in the doorway, one hand resting against her belly. Something unsettled flickered in her eyes. "What is it?" he asked, voice cautious. She hesitated. "My monthly. It hasn't come. I counted twice. It might mean—" Jonas stood still, the cold air rushing past him without bite. His mind reached back to years of solitude, when he'd believed family was lost forever. Then he looked at her, the strong, stubborn woman who had stood unbroken and breathed deep. "If that's true," he said slowly, "then I'm ready." Her shoulders eased, trembling now not from fear but from release. She leaned her forehead to his chest, and his rough hand came to rest gently at the back of her head. In that embrace, there was no exile, no loss, only the present, and a fragile hope too real to deny. That night, firelight bathed the room. Nayeli set the ring inside a small wooden box, placing it beside the cradle Jonas had begun carving. "This isn't just memory anymore," she said, voice firm. "It marks a beginning." Jonas didn't answer, only nodded, eyes soft. In the days that followed, the cabin shifted. It no longer felt like shelter. It felt like a home. When Nayeli stepped into the yard, Jonas watched with quiet pride. When Jonas came in from the fields, her smile no longer carried hesitation. And as the thaw spread across the land, they discovered what neither had thought possible, the certainty that they belonged to one another. Happiness born not from survival, but from the choice to stay, and the joy of knowing that choice was shared. Spring came like a quiet miracle to the hard land. Snow melted into clear streams that cut through the rocks, and the pastures, gray and lifeless all winter, broke open with shoots of green. Jonas stood at the fence line, watching clouds drift slow across the sky, then turned back toward the ranch. Something had changed. The cabin, once only a shell against the wind, now carried signs of life. By the stove stood a wooden cradle, rough-hewn but sturdy, carved by Jonas's hands. At first, it had been nothing but a way to pass the long nights. But with each stroke of the knife, a different feeling grew in him, expectation, the kind he hadn't allowed himself in years. Against the wall, a shelf now held a space of its own for Nayeli folded cloth. Old notebooks Jonas had found, a string of beads she had braided from fiber. Small things, but they marked belonging. The house no longer felt empty. Every corner bore traces of the two of them, the patched blanket Nayeli had sewn, the half-sawn board Jonas had left, the onion shoots sprouting by the fence, the stack of firewood in the yard, piece by piece. They had stitched a life together, until the cabin felt less like survival and more like home. Of course, the wind carried whispers from town. People still remembered the auction, still muttered that Jonas Hale had brought home an Apache woman nobody wanted. Others said he'd gone mad, that she'd leave him sooner or later. Jonas heard it, but only shrugged. None of them had seen what he saw, the truth of a bond forged in silence and choice, not chains. Nayeli stepped onto the porch, flour dust on her hands from baking. She called him in for supper, her voice steady, no longer edged with caution. Jonas caught her eyes under the spring sun. What he saw there wasn't fear. It was trust, plain and unshaken. At the table, sharing a bowl of hot stew, Jonas realized the change ran deeper than the ranch. It was inside him. For years he'd lived just to endure. Now, he lived to share. A meal, a look, a smile, the small weight of her hand against his shoulder. Together, they made something greater than survival. One morning, Nayeli knelt by the cradle, wiping sawdust from the wood. Jonas stepped beside her, his rough palm resting on the edge. "If it's a boy," he said softly, "I want him named after my father." Nayeli looked up, a smile tugging at her lips. "And if it's a girl, we let her choose for herself." They smiled at each other, the kind of smile that said the outside world could talk all it wanted. In here, in this house, they had their own truth. Spring spread across the land. The garden rows turned green. The barn roof stood repaired. The cabin glowed not just with lamplight, but with footsteps, laughter, and quiet moments shared. Jonas no longer walked alone. Nayeli was no longer a shadow forced to stand against the world. They had found a home, not just to exist, but to truly live. So there you have it. Friends. Jonas, once a broken widower, and Nayeli, once called untamable, have carved out a life together. Through silence, through choice, through hope, they've built not just a cabin, but a home. If this story touched you, hit that like button and show your support. Drop a comment below. What do you think is next for Jonas and Nayeli? Will their child be a boy or a girl? And what name should they give? Will the town ever change its view? Or will the couple keep standing against judgment? And most of all, can love built on choice carry them into a future worth fighting for? And don't forget subscribe to stay with us for the next chapter. Because this story isn't over. It's only just beginning. Jonas and Nayeli will need every bit of your support as they step into the future together.